think I'll warm up with a joke because I understand that is how people get into things. So a paladin walks into a temple and says, "Hey, priest, I need you to help me out. All week long, I wake up and then I go out killing people and then I feel terrible about it." The priest says, "Well, let me take a look at you." Casts a few spells and says, "Oh, your alignment is off." That joke should have been much, much longer. But I am here for checking your alignment with Captain Mike. I am Captain Mike. And the alignment that I'm referring to is, of course, not going to be about cars, which is good. I know nothing about cars, but I do know something about role-playing games. And that's what we're going to be talking about. I will be primarily talking about alignment in terms of Dungeons & Dragons, but I think you'll find much of this carries over to other games. I will occasionally be mentioning Vampire, which also has a morality system within it. Along the way, if you have questions, feel free to raise your hand, shout them out. I'll try to address as many as I can. And then I'll also try to leave some time at the end for questions. Although this is the very first time I've run this particular one. So who knows? Maybe I will have put too much in here and then I'll run out of time, as has happened occasionally. All right. Let's get rolling. And I think the best place to start is with who the heck I am, in case you've never seen me before. I am very happy to, like I said, be back at MAGFest. I have been presenting here for a few years. I've presented at a few other places. Too Many Games springs to mind. Wizard World Philadelphia. But I am Captain Mike, or Michael Clegg, if you prefer my actual regular name. As I said, Dungeons & Dragons was the first role-playing game that I played, and so I thought it only appropriate that I put up my own stats. I am a presenter. I am also a teacher when I'm not doing this kind of stuff. I have an MA in writing, a BA in English. I did recently have to upgrade this from 20-something to 30-something years of role-playing, which I wasn't real thrilled about, but it beat the alternative. And I'm an actual teacher. I also included my alignment for this one because it seemed appropriate, and I consider myself to be neutral good. What does that mean? We'll talk about it later, or very shortly. But there is one thing, and certainly if you've seen any of my presentations before, you've seen this slide in at least some variation, and that is that the most important thing to remember about any gaming experience, or indeed I think any experience at all, is that you should know your audience. With gaming, I find that to be especially important because you're telling a story together. And for the vast majority of us, we're not gaming because we're getting paid. This is how we have fun. And I don't want to sit down at a table and then have somebody just waste my time or irritate me. I'm here to have fun. If I'm going to be irritated, I want it to be for a good purpose. So know your audience. If you know that you're dealing with an audience that feels a particular way about something, or if there's a topic that they're not comfortable with, or if there's something that is just not cool with them, don't make it a part of the game. But knowing your audience, and this goes for players as well as DMs, the whole gaming group should be, ideally, on at least roughly the same page. All right, enough of the boilerplate stuff. So here, I really want to get into what alignment is. The reason I came up with this class was because a few years ago, I had noticed a long string of memes, because that's where I get most of my news, where people were talking about lawful good and chaotic evil and neutral good and this, that, and the other. And they started to really irritate me because I noticed that they weren't largely correct. There was as memes are, they had, kind of a brief fad where it was like, oh, here's the Batman universe, characters according to alignments, or here's a bunch of breads according to alignments. Okay, admittedly, it's hard to get upset about whether or not rye is lawful good or chaotic good. I'd have said neutral good. It's the best. But I was thinking, is there a misunderstanding about alignments? I'd always kind of use them a particular way, but I talked to some other gamers, and it seemed like we weren't quite vibing. We weren't quite on the right page. So I started to put this together because it seemed like, alignment was a little misunderstood, and now it's starting to kind of go out of fashion, which is fine. In fact, I have a whole section where I'll talk about just straight up not using it, which does make a lot of what I'm about to say moot. But I think it's worth considering before you toss it out. So we'll talk about alignment. We'll talk about the point of alignment, how it all breaks down, how to use it, and then how to reinterpret it. Maybe the thing about alignment isn't that it doesn't work, it just doesn't work for you, or it doesn't work the way it's presented. And you can always remove it. It's your game, and I can't tell you how to run your game, which may sound strange coming from someone who has a microphone and is about to say a lot of things about games. But I can't tell you how to run your game. I can tell you how to run my game, because I'm the one running it. And I occasionally listen to myself. But if you don't like something, all this stuff, it's all suggestions. It's all interpretations. It's all my thoughts on stuff. Thought I'd, get it out there. And if you have a counterpoint, feel free to share it. All right. Any counterpoints so far? I mean, what could it be on? My table of contents? That's not what's coming up next. It was. So what is alignment? Like I said, Dungeons & Dragons breaks down alignment, meaning the sort of, ethical code that a character or creature or whatever follows, into 9 types, which is made out of 2 parts. The first part, law versus chaos. The second part, good versus evil. We'll get into those specifics in a little bit, but by and large, I think that what's important to remember is that a character's alignment or a creature's alignment is a guideline. It's not as strict, you have to do this because you're this sort of a thing. It's no different than, say, dexterity. If you have a dexterity that's like super high and you need to cross a chasm and you've got a thin rope along it, well, you can tightrope walk that, no problem. You're Legolas. You can just, no problem. If you've got a more moderate dexterity, maybe you're just going to, okay, I'm going to start off kind of like crawling along, going easy, no problem. If you're, Gimli, you're probably going to find a safer way around in the first place. But there's nothing saying that Gimli can't try to tightrope walk it. It's just probably not a good idea. But you can always try. Alignment is that ethical code, and all of us presumably have ethical codes of one kind or another, even if your code is that you don't believe in any kind of overall morality. That's still a code. Even if you don't choose, you've still made a choice. But does that determine your every action? Like, when I set this up, was I like, wow, what would be the most neutral good presentation I could make? Neutral good. Now, if I wanted to make it evil, I could have done like Comic Sans and like white on yellow. That's pretty evil. Poor Comic Sans, it gets so much hate. I kind of like it. But certainly white text on yellow, that's a terrible idea. But yeah, I don't make my coffee thinking like, oh, what's the most lawful good way to make coffee? I mean, I guess I should buy it, not steal it, which I do now that I think about it. So maybe I do make coffee in a lawful fashion. I'm getting ahead of myself. But it's all a guideline. If you're a lawful person, then presumably you follow the rule of law. And you might be opposed to stealing, but does that mean that you won't steal something? Well, you probably won't. But there might be a particular situation where it becomes okay. Or you might do it and then feel bad about it. Or you might do it and not feel bad about it, and then that may be part of a character arc. There are lots of ways to go with this, but ultimately it's just a guideline. If your DM says you wouldn't do that because you're blankety blank, which is an odd thing to say, I suppose, but ideally, that's a suggestion. It's a reminder. If you're playing someone who is good and you're about to resort to torture for no reason, that's not conventionally a good act. But if you're like, well, the fate of the world depends on me getting this information, so I got to torture this guy, and I'm going to feel bad about it, but I don't know another way around it, yeah, maybe. Maybe it's a time for a sort of existential crisis. Who knows? But it's a guideline. It is also both prescriptive and descriptive. Your alignment will determine what your character is likely to do, but it also reflects what your character is likely to do. It actually works both ways. If you play your character one way, then, if you play your character, say, lawful good, then your character's lawful good. If it says on the sheet that your character is chaotic evil, and you've been playing them as lawful good, well then over time, your character becomes lawful good. That's how ethics works. If you can be a very good person, but if you keep punching people in the face for no reason, you're not going to be a good person for long. In fact, you might stop being a good person after the first or second, or third or fourth. It depends on the people. So it kind of works both ways. I find it very handy to have an alignment for my characters, because I find it very handy to, when in those moments where I'm like, which is the most character-specific way to get through this situation? How does my character deal with this moral dilemma? Which of these paths would my character take? If there isn't some other kind of thing motivating me, I can always look down at my alignment. Oh yeah, my character's neutral. Got to consider both aspects here. Oh, my character's evil. What's best for my character? I'll go with that. Oh, my character's good. Well, what would be the best thing for everybody? And it can help guide my actions. On the other hand, if I'm GMing and I've got a player who consistently does evil things, but they're playing someone who's good, it is my responsibility to say, like, hey, I notice you're playing a good character, but you're doing a lot of evil stuff. If you keep doing this, it's going to start shifting, which is generally fine, but sometimes it makes a difference. And for Dungeons & Dragons, sometimes it makes a big difference. It's one thing to be like, are we good or evil in kind of our real world here? And there's a lot of consequences to that. But we don't have spells and we don't have demigods that show up on the regular. And that's a huge difference. Like, our afterlife is based on whatever we believe, and we can't really prove it nearly as easily as in Dungeons & Dragons, where you can have a priest who's like, yo, Thor, just checking in. Is the afterlife still a real thing? Yes, good. All right, I better be whatever would be appropriate. So these are key elements, I think. But ultimately, it's a stat like any other stat. It should be treated as such. All right. So what is the point of alignment? What is the point of even having it? Because you could say, well, Mike, this is all extremely handsome of you, but you could just include this in your character description. And I would say, yeah, you totally could. You could just say, oh, my character is a ranger who likes to do good stuff, but, doesn't like to hang out with others. Isn't that the same as chaotic good? Well, yeah, but alignment is specific about ethics. It specifically breaks down some of the core components of how your character thinks without being, in my opinion, too overly clunky. It doesn't get too thinky. It doesn't get too philosophical. It is occasionally maybe kind of hard to gauge. Is it a little this? Is it a little that? But as a quick kind of reference point, I think it's very handy. Like I said, D&D is such a fantastical world. Like, it's super amazing that we have things like antibiotics, but we still can't walk into a temple and have a priest just like, boom, heal 2d8 hit points of damage. As much as that would be awesome, but it is a fantastical world. And so the idea of the good and evil comes in, I think, more keenly, especially if you're playing a high fantasy game or an epic high fantasy game that emulates things like Lord of the Rings. Lord of the Rings is entirely about good and evil. Sauron is the embodiment of evil. They don't really give us a lot of reasons for that. In fact, unless you're reading into some of the books, it's kind of like yada yada is the evilness of it. It's like, it's blight and despair and so forth. But they don't really say like he goes around keying people's cars or not returning shopping carts or whatever. But that he's evil because he's made out of evil. Everything he touches becomes corrupt. Everything that he deals with becomes horrible. All of the creatures that serve him are generally things that are made as opposed to things that are like natural. And even the things that are natural, those who serve him become themselves corrupt and horrible. That's kind of hard to play off as just being like, well, he's just, doing his thing. He's not a natural part of the world. He is straight up evil. And in a fantastical setting, you do have things that are made out of evil. Liches, anything from the negative material plane. These kind I forgot, 5th edition, they brought back demons and devils. Sorry, sometimes I still forget that it's not like 1st edition or 2nd edition. 2nd edition, they took out demons and devils, called them other stuff, lower plano creatures. But you've got these actual things from the literal 9 hells, the actual abyss. These are not like natural biomes. Now, if you are playing in a more realistic world, well, then you have more reason to consider alignment, more just an ethical code, and more something that's easily removed, or something that's just sort of there, but people don't really think about it. I still think most people don't think about whether what they do on a day-to-day basis is good or not. Blah, 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 good and evil. Good versus evil. What more classic, heroic, epic trope is this? The earliest, all of the original stories are based on things like good and evil, which are themselves kind of problematic concepts. I will try, by the way, during the course of this, not to get too pie in the sky philosophy crazy, and I will also try not to get too deep into literary history and all that nonsense, because this is about how you can use stuff in games. But all of the original stories, they're all, the good hero, the evil monster, which themselves led rise to the stories that brought us Dungeons and Dragons. The only one, of course, standing up here, the only one I can think of is Beowulf and Grendel. Like, what was Beowulf's deal with Grendel? Beowulf didn't even care. He was just a guy who showed up because Heorot kept getting eaten by, kept losing knights to Grendel. What was Grendel's crime? He was a monster. Does that make him evil? Well, yes. According to the actual storyline, which is invented, yeah, he was evil. And even if he wasn't evil, it's still kind of a problem because he was eating like 20, 30 great heroes a night for like 3 weeks or something. Like, it was nuts. I don't know what the population was of that place before Beowulf showed up, but it got a lot lower. Beowulf didn't even spring into action that night until Grendel had eaten 20 soldiers. Like, really? That was the price of your cover? You were just going to spring it anyway, dude. Get in there. Jeez. Anyway, enough bashing Beowulf. Take that, Beowulf. Good versus evil. You can think of this as the light side versus the dark side. And what more classic example of the light side and dark side than the series that gave us those names? Star Wars. Star Wars is a great example of the nebulous concept of good versus the nebulous concept of evil. The, Obi-Wan, Luke, Vader, some other people, they both represent their own sides, and they do it in a very, very general fashion. And if and even playing the Star Wars role-playing games, good side and light side, they're very kind of like, yeah, the good is the generally good. You know what good is? It's when you do nice things for people and that sort of stuff. And when you're evil, you grow horns and throw people into furnaces or something. Like, that's kind of about what it is. I remember playing the Star Wars video games, and in many cases, the more evil you are, like the more physically like malevolent you get. Your skin turns different colors and you get hair, horns and stuff. And I always thought, wow, it's got to be really easy to tell if somebody's evil. How do you like hide that? Like, oh, you're looking more evil today, Jim. Are you okay? Oh, yes, I'm doing fine. I was just helping somebody die. Their hair. All right, Jim. But the light side versus the dark side. Good versus evil. Good in the books, I find, it's hard to find a good definition of good. What is good? Good is that thing. In the books, often it refers to just that feeling of doing things for other people. It's that, it's good. How do you define good? Well, I find generally speaking, good is defined as doing things that make things better for other people. Not just, in many cases, just not making things worse, but actually making things better. So if your hero is good, they're likely to do things because it helps other people. Conversely, evil tends to be more along the lines of selfishness. Now, you can, of course, have the evil where you just, hate life, hate all things that live, destroy. It's hard to find that kind of almost cartoonish supervillainy evil outside of a 4-color cereal or a 4-color cereal? Sorry, I thought it was the 40s again. So, like a 4-color comic book, Crash Pal Bam. That's sort of like old-fashioned Lex Luthor stealing 10 pies, but also like destroying the planet sort of thing. Most people, when they're evil, what they really are is they're just selfish. They don't care about other people. They're not concerned about the welfare of other people. And that is really what tends to become what we consider evil, because they're willing to do what's good for them at the expense of other people. Good people are willing to do what's good for themselves, but not at the expense of other people. And I think that's perhaps the simplest way to consider the difference between good and evil. On the other hand, there are different aspects of what is considered to be good for other people. Like if you, this is the classic quandary, if you see somebody stealing bread to feed their family, what should you do? And this is one of those things where you should say, well, it's okay to steal bread for your family, and then you can justify stealing. Or you can say it is not okay to steal, in which case you can justify any act of law. And there is no right answer. There's also, I suppose, no wrong answer. But here you may start getting into things like different interpretations of good and evil. You can have two characters who are good be morally opposed to the same idea. Look, I really hate to be topical in my talks because I prefer the sort of timeless quality that comes with the aloof and disaffected. But there are a lot of times where I butt heads with people where we both want what would be considered good, but we can't agree how to do it. Because our priorities are different. They're both good. We both want what's best for as many people as possible. But can we best accomplish this way? Can we best accomplish it that way? I may have mentioned that I was a teacher. This comes up a lot. If any of you are in the teaching profession, how can we help these students? Well, what would best help students? Yeah, get 3 teachers into any conversation about how best to help their students. There's no way you're going to get anything done. No one can agree. That's just one particular example. So you can have good characters versus good characters. You may also find that different cultures consider different things good and different things evil. This is especially true the farther back in history you go. One of the things I noticed among Roman mythology and Greek mythology on which it was based is that it is good to kill monsters and get treasure and be famous. Those are all qualities of good people. Now, these days, we're not as keen on rolling up into somebody's home, calling them a monster, stabbing them, and then getting famous for it while pocketing the cash. But that's more of a cultural disconnect. If you went back to Athens, okay, you could still go to Athens today. But I mean, if you went to Athens a few thousand years ago, you'd have a much different response. People would be like, yeah, of course, you should kill them. They were evil. They were a monster. Didn't you see the one-eyed, 20 feet tall thing? Yeah, kill them, take the treasure. That's what a good person does. So you may have different cultural concepts of good and evil. By and large, in terms of alignment, we sort of, again, go with that gooey sort of generally good, what helps other people, generally evil, what is best for the person without concern for others. Evil, perhaps more universal. Horribly. And then finally, like I said before, when it comes to alignment, it is okay to mess things up. You can take missteps, and you can atone for them or not as your choice. If you're a good person and you do something evil, well, why you did it, that counts for a lot. If I'm a good person, I do like to generally think of myself as a good person. I mean, I wrote neutral good on my character sheet. But if I think of myself as a good person, and I'm like, oh man, I don't have any money. I need to, I'm on this quest to go save this person. Am I the kind of person who's going to hide in the back of somebody's pickup truck so that way I can, get someplace? That's not really a good thing, hiding and sneaking and kind of sneaking a lift. But I might do it if the thing that I'm doing is more good than the error that I'm doing. And I'll feel bad about it, maybe. And then you can take that even further. Well, what else would I do for the greater good? Would I be willing to steal for the greater good? Would I outright, take an old lady's purse because I need that money to help me on my quest to do the good thing? How far would I go? And of course, there's going to be a point where I'm like, okay, I'm doing more evil than I am doing good. I can't cross certain boundaries. But there is going to be that thick layer of kind of caramelly gooiness where I'm like, I could do this, but only in the right circumstances. I think I could write that off as being a situational thing, but only in the right circumstances. Characters should be like that too. And there will be times where they'll make the wrong call. Maybe they'll do something because it's, okay, yeah, it's kind of mean or bad, but it's expedient. Or they just didn't have any other options. Or they got tricked into it. How a character reacts to that is also a part of their alignment. It's also a part of their story. It's a part of their character. And I feel like that's a very key element. It's not just about always following the rules. It's about what you do when you fail to follow the rules for whatever reason. Do you feel bad about it? Does the character decide, hey, wait a minute, I stole stuff and nothing bad happened. Maybe I'm going to start stealing more stuff. Maybe this is the beginning of their change from being, goody-goody two-shoes to little thievery. The vampire masquerade setting uses humanity. It's a sliding scale from 10 to 1, pointing out that very few humans are ever actually at a 10 humanity. Most of us hover around the 7-ish, where we're like, yeah, we don't kill people, but sometimes we speed. We break laws occasionally. Those one time I taped some football. I'm kidding. I've never taped football in my life. But we're willing to bend the rules a bit. And then it actually uses a sliding scale. So that way you could be like, oh, I'm okay with stealing stuff, but killing is past the line. And you can go farther down the line where it's like, hey, some people gotta die. Which is a great line. It's directly from the vampire book. Some people gotta die. That's how things are, man. And all the way down to the point where you're no longer a playable character because you're just simply so mindlessly disconnected from reality. Conversely, a 10 humanity is almost impossible to maintain because who can do everything in such a saintly fashion that they never cross any social mores? I mean, it sounds really terrible when I say it out loud. I'm who could be good all the time? But, nothing. Not even a little over the speed limit. Anyway. But atonement, missteps and atonement, that's kind of a big deal, especially in a world, I think, where you have a literal afterlife that you can go to and come back from. All right, good and evil. All right, Mike, we got that idea. We know what's good. We know what's evil. What about this law and chaos business? Law and chaos, I think, is the harder part of the alignment to understand because it's not as intuitive. And I think it's not as intuitive because it really has a couple of pieces moving. One of them is that law versus chaos tends to deal with how people relate to other people. So a lawful character is more inclined to see groups as being more valuable than the individual. Conversely, a chaotic character is going to see individuals as being more important than the groups. The archetype of the chaotic good character, Robin Hood, just directly out of the second edition Player's Handbook. Yeah, Robin Hood, he's fighting the power. He doesn't follow the rule of law, but he does good things. Steals from the rich, gives to the poor. Now you might say like, Mike, I've read the Robin Hood stories, and Robin of Locksley was already a member of the aristocracy, and he leads because he is a member of the aristocracy. And I would say I also watched the Kevin Costner movie, and it was great. I prefer Men in Tights because I think it's better acted. Yeah, hot take. You didn't expect that here in an alignment class, but yeah, take that. But yeah, so Robin Hood, chaotic character. Now this is where we get into sort of the area where alignment it's only two parts. It's supposed to be a complicated ethical code. But if you're dealing with chaos, then you're not willing to, if you're a chaotic character, the idea is that you're not willing to sell out individuals just for the sake of the group. You can still work in groups. You can still be part of society. But you're not willing to say, okay, the society needs to maintain, so these individuals need to shape up or ship out. They're the kind of people who say, no, society needs to change, because if it's not for everyone, then to heck with it. Conversely, if you are lawful, you believe in groups. You believe that the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. You recognize that individuals, they may have to fend for themselves, because when you're dealing with actual groups, especially larger groups like cities and so forth, you have to look out for the good of the entire group and maintain that sort of thing through time. Both of these extremely valid. In fact, you can find a pile of philosophers who argue for both of them. And so what it comes down to is the character. Does the character believe one way or the other? Does the character prefer the idea that, yes, the group is what is important? Does the chaotic character, do they say, no, individuals come first? This is an area also where you can have some cross between. There are times where a chaotic character is like, all right, yeah, we may have to sell out these 2 people in favor of these 20 million people. But by and large, this Law and Chaos also kind of cover the underlying concept of the universe, like how we generally think of things. Lawful characters are supposed to think of things as being more orderly and structured, like things happen for a reason. Conversely, chaotic characters, as befits the name, believe that there is no order to the universe and that things just sort of happen. Maybe they're caused by things, sure, but there's no like plan. There's no like overall reason for things. Sometimes things happen just because, it's bad luck or it sucks. Both of these things are kind of wrapped up into the law versus chaos, and I think it's one of the reasons why law and chaos get a little wibbly. But I also think it's really handy. And I think it's kind of interesting to consider who ends up in what position. Classically, paladins are lawful good. Like, that's kind of their standard brand. They're lawful good, and I've heard them referred to as lawful stupid. I don't know if you have. I've heard both lawful stupid and chaotic. Ooh, technically I run a kids show, or a family show, so chaotic, something bad. You can insert your own epithet if you like. And these, I get why they're saying it. And it seems like lawful good characters should be very boring. Like, oh, you follow all the rules and you do what's best for everybody. Again, it sounds terrible when I say it out loud. But why does that have to be bad? Just because you believe that groups are important and just because you want to do what's best for people doesn't mean you have to play a boring character. One of my favorite characters actually was a paladin. He was lawful good. He admittedly spent most of his time hip deep in mud fighting undead monsters because that's what he loved to do. He was, he kind of like lived in like a Castlevania style Dungeons and Dragons setting. Not quite Ravenloft, not quite anything else. But it was lawful good. Sure, he didn't work in a group, but he worked to support groups. He worked because townspeople needed protection from the hordes of undead that the world just kind of kept pouring out. And he was never happier than when he was, hip deep in gore, smashing zombies and vampires in the face. And he was great. And he certainly wasn't lawful stupid. He definitely knew what was going on. And he, even though he did have party members who were not also lawful good, he had, there was a lawful neutral and chaotic good, but he could vibe with them. He was like, all right, I understand that you don't have the same priorities. Another classic thing that I've heard is where people have a party of all kinds of different characters, and then the paladin has to turn their head, and then the thief can go do the illegal stuff that the party needs to get by. And then that's supposed to be okay. And I would say that's not okay. If you're a lawful person, or if you're a good person, or if you're I suppose it's easier for evil people to hang out with good people and feel okay. But if you're a good person, are you still a good person if the company you keep does evil stuff and you allow them to get away with it? And certainly if you are a lawful person and you're with criminals and you let them get away with it, are you still lawful? There is the consideration of guilty by association. And so you might have a character who's just, they're lawful good, but they're incredibly oblivious and they're kept entirely in the dark. But I always worry whenever people start mixing and matching different alignment groups because they don't really gel. Would any of us gel with a group of people who have radically different beliefs about what's good or evil? I don't even like the idea of people who are willing to go through my stuff. Evil people would go through my stuff in a heartbeat. They're evil. You can't trust them by definition. That's not true. You can always trust them to be evil. I think that was in a pirate movie. What makes a man go neutral? To quote Zap Brannigan of Futurama, my favorite TV show. Neutrality is the middle ground. It's the middle child of law and chaos and also good and evil. And if you are neutral in both terms, you are occasionally referred to as being true neutral or neutral neutral, whatever. Neutrality is in kind of a tough part because it's the non-alignment. You can be neutral just because you don't have enough thought or thinking capacity or concern for the universe to have an alignment. Elementals are great examples of neutral. Any kind of automaton would be considered neutral because where's your ethics if you're not a thing that has ethics? But neutrality can be considered the balance. It's like, okay, so I believe in groups, but I also believe in the power of the individual, but I don't think either one can really be sold out entirely for the other. I can see the purpose in both places. Likewise, you might be like, all right, I like helping other people, I like when they're doing okay, but I'm not going to go out of my way for it. And I also like the part where I get to do what I want, but I'm not going to do terrible things for it. Consider neutrality. Something I've had some players try is the idea of neutrality as balance in the sense of well, I was good on Monday, so I should be evil on Tuesday, and then I'll be good on Wednesday, and then I'll be evil on Thursday, and then Friday I won't go out. And then the weekend, we'll see how it goes. That isn't really neutral. That's not balance. That's oscillating wildly from one side to the other, which is really more chaotic than anything else. Because if you can't even keep that kind of consistency on a day-to-day basis, that's pretty chaotic. I mean, again, by definition. But neutrality does represent both the idea of kind of keeping both things in mind, but also the idea that you may be moving from one to the next. Characters don't go from lawful good to chaotic evil in a heartbeat without a helm of alignment, or helm of opposite alignment, or other related magical items. But they have to, they do the slow shift. So when you have neutral characters, sometimes they're just in transitioning between evil and good. They're moving between law and chaos. Sometimes they are, kind of cognizant of the balance. Neutral characters are kind of handy because, they can go both ways. But it's important to consider what kind of neutrality they are. And also to remember that neutrality doesn't just mean you get to do whatever you want. Again, that then becomes evil and should reflect it. You dig? Cool. I have to say, this is the first presentation I've done where people are masked. So I'm going to assume that you're all smiling broadly. And I appreciate the mask that has a broad smile on it. Makes it very easy for me. I am also smiling intensely. The entire mask is my smile, by the way. Actually, that's a terrifying thought. I would like to retract that statement. That is not true. All right. Using alignment effectively. So you're like, okay, Mike, we got the idea. Good, evil, chaos, law. Yes, John Locke, Calvin Hobbes. All right. Sorry, not Calvin Hobbes. Oh. John Calvin, Thomas Hobbes, or Calvin and Hobbes, if you wanted the more fun version. So, all right, so we've got these ideas. Evil, good, gotcha. But what do you do? Well, the best purpose, as I mentioned, is it's a reference point. It is a great reminder. That idea of which thing you should be focused on. I'll use my alignment if I'm like, okay, should we, go through the village of orcs because it's a faster way to our destination and we know we're going to end up in a fight, or do we take some extra time to go around? Well, an evil character probably would have a much easier time saying, well, the village is the fastest way and I don't mind killing a bunch of orcs. A good character might say, well, the orcs aren't hurting anybody and we have a little bit of time, better to go around. A neutral character might consider the different options, weigh the variables a little bit more closely. So yeah, I use it as a reference point. It's very handy, both for, by the way, player characters and non-player characters, especially when I have a lot of non-player characters or only a few handful of notes about non-player characters. It can be a handy kind of guideline. Of course, Dungeons & Dragons being a game that has spells in it, spell effects sometimes do deal with different types of alignments. Here is where I may show some of my unfamiliarity with 5th edition. I've only played a little bit of it as opposed to 2nd edition where I've played decades of it. But even doing things like Holy Word, which will affect evil characters, or characters, evil creatures, demons and stuff. These kinds of spell effects, they sometimes happen. Magical items sometimes react differently to people who are good aligned, people who are evilly aligned. These sorts of things. Messing up should not, I think, be like a game stopper. Now, you might kind of get the record scratch if you've got someone who's extremely good and suddenly they do something that's just horrifically evil. They're like, I know I've been playing absolutely perfectly good for now, but I'm definitely going to kick over that old lady and take her purse because, I wanted a couple more copper coins. It's like, wow, that's really evil. There's no real gain for that. That seems like it's more performative than anything else. That might be a record scratch, but if you've got a character that fails to be the alignment that they want to be, well, then that's a great point for an arc. Is the character someone who just lost their way and they really wanted to be that alignment? They might not think of it in terms of that alignment, but you know what I mean? It's like, I thought I was a good person, but then I did all of these terrible things. And then the question is, well, is this now their downward spiral? Have they reached that point where they're like, well, I've done so many bad things, in for a penny, in for a pound, am I right? Stab, stab. Or is this the part where they're like, oh my goodness, I didn't realize how many times I slipped up. I didn't realize just how many times I just blew straight past the morality of the situation. And then you can consider redemption arcs. What do they do to atone for it? It's like, oh, geez, I didn't... Or maybe it's something where they need to consider I didn't mean to burn down that village. That was an accident. But even that kind of carries weight. And when you're dealing with, especially when you get up to high-level characters, high-level characters, they sometimes go to places like Elysium. They sometimes go to places like heaven or hell. And, maybe that character that thought they were so good, they get down to the 9 hells and Demogorgon is like, hey, good to see you, buddy. You're going to be spending a lot of time here. Ooh. Didn't think I'd have a room with my name on it. That was supposed to be funnier. I'm sorry. Oh, look, a spot right next to Sauron. It's the best I got. Thank you for your pity chuckles. But my point is that messing up, just like I did there, that can be a chance to really consider what you've done wrong. What can your character do? How boring is it when you have a story and the characters don't change? That dynamic quality, that is what we look for in stories. That thing where they're like, okay, they encountered these issues, they had these problems. How do they overcome these problems? That's all part of it. It's not all killing goblins and stealing their money. Unless it is. I'm not here to tell you how to run your game. Which actually brings me to a point that's not on this particular list, which is one of the advantages of alignment is that it doesn't affect a lot of things in the game. And sometimes you just need to kill the bad guy. And I don't want that to get lost. Like, I think there's a lot of value in creating a gaming world that feels real, a gaming world that embodies characteristics of the real world, and especially if you're playing a game that takes place in the real or real-ish world, these are things to consider. But sometimes you've had a hard day. Good guy's good, bad guy's bad. That's all you need. And there's a lot of games and a lot of movies where the bad guys, they're bad, and that makes it okay to kill them. Like the end of the Avengers movie, the end of the Lord of the Rings movies, the end of virtually every movie that involves some kind of epic hero. There's always those enemies where it's like, yeah, they're evil, and that makes it okay to kill a lot of them. And they're trying to kill us, which makes it even, easier. I don't remember anybody talking about the Chitauri as being like terribly evil. Like they weren't bad guys. Who knows? Maybe they were tricked into it. Then the Avengers are the evil guys. Yeah, that's right. Hot take. But sometimes you just want that, Anyway, back to moral quandaries. Changing alignment, moral quandaries. I got to start reading further into my list before I go down. Moral quandaries can be really interesting. Like, it's very easy if you have like a good aligned party and they go into town and find out that it's run by someone who's lawful evil and is using the entire town to their own benefit. But what if they get into town and the place is being run by someone who's just lawful neutral? That means that they're going along with the laws, whether the laws are good or evil, because it's what's best for the town. Well, suddenly that's a harder sell. It's like, okay, well, yeah, you've got these laws, but you're hurting people. And the person's like, yeah, but I get it, but the law is what keeps the town safe and keeps it together. So we can't change. It becomes more of an ethical quandary because the person's not doing things deliberately to hurt people, just some people get hurt. You can have good versus good. Like I said, two people who agree on how things should be done, but they can't quite agree on how it should be done. Lawful good, chaotic good, both classic examples. It's very easy to have the Sheriff of Nottingham be the foil to Robin Hood, because Sheriff of Nottingham, every description of him is incredibly evil. Depending on which version of the sheriff you read, it's not whether or not he's evil, it's how ridiculously evil he is. Even Prince John is usually less evil than the sheriff is. Usually. I mean, there was that animated one where Prince John was the lion. That was pretty evil. My favorite scene in that, though, the Sheriff of Nottingham throwing the coin into the blind mouse's cup so that the other coins in the cup jump up and he catches them. So evil. Anyway. But yeah, so you could have like chaotic good, but suppose Robin Hood had to go up against someone who was lawful good. Someone who needed the laws to be run, but still wanted what was best for people, even though that might have meant that a few stragglers and outliers were not getting the best deal. Chaotic good versus lawful good. How do you do, what do you do when both sides are good? You got to start working around problems, and you can't just stab your way through them as easily, unless you're an evil party, and then, hey, just take over, right? But yeah, so you can get these very interesting different ideas. If you are a lawful character and you end up in a situation where the person in charge is evil, but they're the lawful ruler, what do? How does a paladin deal with an evil prince? The prince is there by law, and everything he does is legal. He can literally make the law. His word is law. So how does a paladin fight that? You can't just ride up and be like, well, you're not a good enough prince. You're not a good enough king. You're not a good enough queen. Stabby stab. Break out the Holy Avenger. You gotta find ways around it. And sometimes you may even have a quest where the goal of the quest is to say like, hey, you can't save everybody. Or you can't save every town. Maybe the best you can do is get people out who want to get out. These can be some interesting things in between all the stabbing. That's fine. Little stabby stab on the side, just keep things interesting. You gotta have those action set pieces. And of course, there's the grand tradition of good and evil. Classic, heroic, epic stories, they're all based around good and evil. They all come back to these concepts. What is good? What is evil? Good wins the day. Evil is destroyed. How classic is that? That's why Star Wars did so well. It's that classic story. Good versus evil. Kid versus parent. So maybe you're like, okay, Mike, I've listened to you for a while and I'm sick of it because I've heard all of this stuff about alignment, but it just doesn't work for me. I don't dig the good versus evil thing. I don't think anything is inherently good or inherently evil. And I would say that's very neutral of you. There we go. And so you can change alignment. You can change up how it works. One thing you can do, you can switch the alignment to be specific to particular honor codes, in which case it's not about good and evil, it's about which set of rules you choose to abide by, if any. Or it could be alignment to specific nations or religions. So you could be like, oh, yeah, I'm definitely good according to this church, but according to that church, I'm terrible. But I follow this church, so that's good. One example I had for this was I was running a game of Dungeons and Dragons in the 1700s, like it advanced to Age of Exploration. I wanted orc pirates, that's what it came down to. So we had orcish navies and gnoll pirates and humans and stuff, and it was definitely more of a country versus country sort of a situation. There was a new continent full of people to attack and oppress, and countries were going back and forth. I really wanted to capture that golden age of piracy thing. There's a reason I call myself Captain Mike. And I took out alignment on the basis that it no longer fit the setting because, well, what is good or evil? Even to use a historical example, Sir Francis Drake was, as the name implies, knighted by the Queen of England and is considered a national hero in England for his efforts against the Spanish, who hate him and consider him one of history's most notorious and least trustworthy pirates, and definitely a bad person. What a great example of someone who, across a very small bit of water, definitely a good person, definitely an evil person. Depends on who you are. And so for that setting, I took out alignment in terms of lawful or chaotic or good and evil because it just didn't mesh with the concept. Instead, it was more considered alignment to different countries. Were you aligned to a country, or were you just, in it for yourself? You can also keep alignment, but instead of considering it to be such an overarching part of the characters, consider it to be more intent. I often do this with spell effects that detect good or evil characters, detect evil and that sort of stuff. It doesn't detect whether or not a person is evil, but whether or not they're considering an evil action. So if they're like, oh, it's time for murdering, it pings as evil typically. But if they're like, I'm going to give to charity, well, that would ping as good. But ordinarily, most of the time, people are, they're neutral. You're probably not walking around MAGFest wondering what's the most chaotic good way to go around MAGFest? Though if you have ideas, I am keen to hear them. And then, of course, if you're like, what, this alignment thing just doesn't work. I consider it, a bygone relic. Or maybe you just say, this game just doesn't work. It doesn't work in it because the lines are too gray or it's just too messy or I just don't want to deal with it. Remember, it's your game. You can just remove it entirely and then just, go off of whatever you want. But I don't know. I feel like alignment is too useful to just simply discard without considering it. So if you do remove it, I hope that you do so thoughtfully. As indeed, I hope you do everything thoughtfully. Well, I've talked about everything about alignment from start to finish, including removing it. So thank you very much. My name is Captain Mike. I can be reached at captainmike@captainmike.net. I do have business cards if anybody needs them. I will also be here quite a bit. In fact, I will be in this very room tomorrow, same time, same channel, for running tabletop RPGs online. It's been a crazy couple of years. And even before that, I was running some games online, and I've been in some games online. So if you're wondering how to take your pen and paper stuff, make it the digital. I'll be right here tomorrow, 5:30 to 6:30. I'll also then on whatever day is after tomorrow, Saturday. It's written in front of me. On Saturday, I'll be talking about running role-playing games for new players. Maybe this past year or two, some people started to come in. Maybe kids have gotten older and they've decided to get into it. Maybe you've made some new friends. And they're like, hey, let's bring in some new players. I'll be talking about that on Saturday at 5:30 to 6:30. And then if you're still around and still awake on Sunday morning, I'll be here talking about how to build a better hero 10 to 11 a.m. Sunday, all of which I believe are here, in fact, right in this very room. So most of the convention I will be through this door. They have some coffins. I just kind of lay back, and then they're like, Mike, we need you to talk about some stupid role-playing ideas and say things into a microphone. And I'm like, yes, finally. Which is not true. If you do see me around the convention, of course, and you want to ask me a question or just say hi, feel free to do so. You can usually see me. I normally in a black and gold pirate coat. Obviously not wearing it now. But yes, at this time, I believe I have a handful of minutes still, assuming I could read a clock correctly, which is a risky assumption at best. So these are the other places you can see me this weekend. But if anybody has any questions or just anything that they want to voice because they're sick of hearing me, happy to entertain. Yes?
What do you think about gamifying the idea of morality? For example, I have honor points, and if I have honor points, send them a favor.
That is an interesting premise. The unfortunately named Oriental Adventures for first edition used honor points. Basically, bringing in the Asian setting and the idea of honor. I think it can work. Like anything else, you kind of need to consider, is this helpful? I think it's a risky proposition to use it as a sort of carrot stick sort of idea for players. You get freebie points for doing good stuff. But I think if you're playing a character who's particularly tied to an alignment or tied to a morality, and a player is willing to make things more difficult for themselves to follow that, they should be rewarded. So whether that's with extra experience points or favors, favors I would think would have to be more game specific. So especially if you have a priest who bends over backwards to make sure that they're doing the right thing for their religion. Well, in a game with spell casting, maybe suddenly enough of that, and then there's a week of extra spell slots or extra experience or something like that. So I think that should be rewarded. I always think good role playing should be rewarded. And I think staying true to the idea of the character or following an interesting concept of the character should be rewarded. How you codify that in terms of honor points, that may take some tweaking. And it may take some consideration on how you want it to play out in the game. I play with some gamers who are very much the spirit of the game, and I play with some gamers who are very much the letter of the game. So I'm always kind of towing the line where it's okay, if I implement a system, how can this be abused the most? And then I try to make sure that doesn't happen. So, does that sufficiently answer your question? Yes. Yes?
Do you have any experience or insight for introducing either the characters or players themselves to new settings or culturally that outside of this and they want to
Okay. So the question, just so that everyone heard it and to make sure I understood it, is dealing with characters that are moving to or going into new areas where you have clashing cultural values, culture shock. So in something like Dungeons and Dragons, alignment is supposed to be more or less universal, which is aided by the fact of, again, having literal gods and demigods. So technically, you should be able to go to anywhere on the planet and you still have the same premises of good and evil, the same premises of law and chaos, maybe a few bits and pieces here or there. But I think if you wanted to really get into the idea of you think you're a good person and then you go to this place where everyone acts differently, I think I only have some experience with that. I think it'd be an interesting experience for all involved, and I would certainly hope so. But I would also, in setting that up, kind of figure the trajectory, because there are a few different ways to do that, right? If I think I'm a good person and I go to a place where everyone does evil things and they call it good, am I going to believe that they're good? No, I'm going to believe that they're evil and they just either don't know it or don't want to admit to it. Both are very evil things. And it is also our natural intention, I think, by and large as people, to always believe that what we're doing is the best thing, because if it wasn't the best thing, we would be doing something else, which is the cause of virtually every war in history. So there is a lot of that. And I think that's also why you end up with, different groups that just never get along with each other. Elves and dwarves are great examples. There's nothing alignment-based that should make them opposed to each other. They just never really understand each other. So fight. But I would consider it carefully. That's definitely a know your audience sort of a situation, partly because it is so eerily familiar to so many terrible events in human history. That I would be very careful not to accidentally do exactly one of those things. Or put my players in a position where they then have to do those terrible things, or feel that they have to. Yes? Ooh, players who have conflicting alignments. I usually cast no alignment on all of my players beforehand. I'm kidding, that's not how no alignment works. Yeah, I knew I'd get some people who were like, yeah, you're darn right, that's not how that works. That's only for detecting other planar creatures and things made of evil, Mike. Sorry, I distracted myself with my own nerdetry. That can be tough. That is something that definitely we run into, I think all of us run into, even just not on the gaming table, but like, yeah, my idea of what is good may be different than your idea of good. My idea of evil may be different than your idea of evil. I would think that after a while of gaming with some people, you kind of get an idea of what they consider to be good or evil. Ultimately, I think it comes down to the dungeon master or the game master to determine what the game considers to be good or evil. But if you have players whose opinions of ethics vary too wildly, my regular gaming group, there's a reason why we all have very similar ethics, and it's because that's part of what makes us all get along. Even though we have, there are gray areas where we're like, well, I feel this way, you feel that way. By and large, we're all pretty much on the same page as to whether or not we're think certain things are good or bad. And I think that might just be part of having a harmonious player group. Any group of players kind of needs to have that simpatico quality. They have to have at least some of the same values. Otherwise, key elements are just kind of, they're going to grate against each other. And you don't want a situation where you have two characters who are having a conflict of alignment, where it's really the players using it as like a puppet show to argue about politics or argue about their particular personal opinions. That's a really long way of saying no. It's a very long way. But I think what it comes down to is knowing your audience. Not every group needs to be the same gaming group. And if two people are so opposed that it becomes a problem, then maybe they shouldn't game together. But I've never had to remind people. That's not true. I have had to remind people about things being good or evil, because sometimes it's easy to forget. In fact, when I was talking to a friend of mine about this class, he brought up an example of the party was like, oh yeah, we were going to torture this guy because he had information. And I was like, that sounds very evil. And he was like, yeah, but we needed the information and we didn't actually do it. And I was like, that's terrifying. Because afterwards, your excuse was it didn't work. Not that you shouldn't have done it. You shouldn't have done it. I don't game with him much. And so I think there is that element. We do live in a world, in fact, if you play role-playing games online, you can always find other people to game with. There are people that I've just kind of stopped gaming. I mean, I've stopped gaming with people for a lot of reasons, time, distance, so forth, being chief among them. But some gamers I don't game with because we don't vibe right. So then the storyline gets muddy because my idea of a good character doesn't match their idea of a good character. And so, if we're constantly at odds, it's not going to work out. It's like dating that way. Sometimes you just got to be like, I like you. We can still be friends. But I don't want to game. A fairly long-winded no, but I hope there were enough qualifiers in there that it helps you out a little bit. All right. I believe I just have a couple of minutes. Anybody other? Ooh, yes. The Ozymandias Quandary. So Ozymandias of Watchmen fame, if you haven't read one of the greatest comic books ever written or a mediocre to good movie. Yep, more hot takes. What do you do when you have someone who's, and that's a great setup, by the way. Having a villain, you're setting up the big bad, they're like such a monster, they do all of this terrible stuff. And you get there and they're like, yes, if I didn't do that, the world would have been destroyed. Or, if I didn't do that, worse things would have happened. There are a couple of ways to play that, and I think it's a really good twist. If you do it too often, though, people tend to expect it. And there is that thing you get up there, and there are a couple of ways you can play it. You can do the character that has actually become corrupt, and they're doing evil things because they keep writing off that it's for the greater good, but they're actually evil. A person's alignment isn't always known to themselves. So they may be like, yes, this is the best thing. And then it's like evil, 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 evil. But, you can get up there and be like, oh, suddenly the perspective is what changes it. And that can be interesting itself because, you come in there, blades out and magic spells at the ready. And the bad guy's like, you're the villain. You've been the villain this whole time. And then, you get this kind of a thing. And then how that plays out depends a lot on the villain, depends a lot on the characters. This may be a strange comparison. Fallout 4, one of the DLCs, has a villain who sends out robots that kill people. And she thinks that the player is the villain because you keep breaking all of the machines. And it turns out that she thought the machines were helping people, and the machines were essentially lying to her. And it's a really great moment. You can choose to be like, okay, well, that doesn't, just because you didn't know doesn't mean that you're not guilty of these crimes, kapow. Or you can be like, well, you messed up, you have to do better and atone for it. Or you can say, like, I don't care, because that's how Fallout rolls. But it's a fascinating sort of a thing where you can also have the misguided person, and then you show them like, oh, this is what's really happening. They're like, oh my goodness. And then you can work forward from there. And if you're looking for an ending to an arc that is not like stabby confrontational, it can be very interesting, and it can allow for a lot of really good role playing, even if that role playing is just to keep certain party members from killing the person before they can explain it. So I think it's definitely workable, and it's actually very interesting. I think it happens in real life more often than we think. All right, and I believe that is actually the last question I can take, because I am actually out of time. So thank you very much. I've been Captain Mike. I will be here all weekend with a number of other classes. I hope to see you there, and if not, please do very much enjoy this MAGFest. It is great to be back. Thank you so much.